Good morning. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tiffany Friesen, and I am the Senior Director of Partnership Engagement here with the United Way. I want to welcome you to the April InForum Partnership Breakfast on the culture of collective impact. It's great to see all of you here this morning. We have a great conversation planned for you. The purpose of the InForum Breakfast, I think we've shared with you in the past, is really to learn together, to see each other, and to deepen our relationships, to more easily collaborate and identify solutions for our communities. We also hope this is a place where you will find new partners. About a year ago, we launched the Child Wellbeing Initiative. We embarked on sharing maps with you, and we looked at communities that identified areas where we have the least resources, and looked at zip codes that showed the areas that have the least resources, and we were able to look at zip codes all the way down to zip codes so that we could identify strategies for children and families and communities, and then develop strategies where we could measure our progress and look collectively at solutions. The reason we identified this InForum series is so that we could spend time together and establish our relationships together. And what we've done, we wanted to kind of look back at our last 2 months together and kind of review the things that we have discussed. We've been looking at taking a systems approach at driving collective action in the service of child well-being. In February, we talked about eliminating poverty through place-based work with Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett from Boston's Vital Village, with Frank Fernandez with the Blank Foundation's Westside Works, and John Majors with Purpose-Built Communities. And they shared with us the importance of community input and engagement. They talked about how they approach addressing the systemic issues of poverty and disinvestment in Atlanta's West and East Side neighborhoods. And they shared with us what they think we can learn about their experiences. And then in March, we moved on to talk about power and trust with Professor Tiziana Deering from Boston College and Rohit Malhotra from the Center for Civic Innovation. They talked about their work and strategies that included increasing civic engagement to get out the vote, to decentralizing leadership so that grants are determined by leaders in neighborhoods. Tiziana challenged us to think about ROH, a return on people, instead of ROI, which is a return on investment, which is how we often refer to our work. And all of this ties together as we determine where we plug in to play our part in support of children and families in child well-being. One role that we can play in the child well-being movement at the United Way is a convener and catalyst. And through InForum, we hope to build knowledge and relationships and to add to the culture we know is needed to support a healthy community. And so as we continue to get to know each other better, we remind ourselves that all of this requires a culture change, which is in the title of today's session, Culture, the culture of collective impact. And just what is that? We're going to learn more about that today from Paul and Katherine and Rick, and from all of you during our brief time this morning. Our region will never achieve a state of well-being for our children and families if we operate individually. It will require a collective approach. I think this is one thing we can probably all agree on. It's the how and the when and the what's next that we have to talk about and feel our way into, which is why we're glad that you're here this morning for this conversation. And so we can get a sense of who's here today. We're going to ask that each of you do a quick round of introductions in the room. And we're going to start with Laura over here to my left, Laura Hyman, who's a member of the Partnership Engagement Team. If you would, please, as she approaches you, just stand and give us your name and the name of your organization. We'll be able to kind of quickly run through the room and hear from each of you. Thanks, Laura.
Good morning. My name is Laura Hyman. I'm with the Partner Engagement Team at United Way.
Paul Schmitz from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Katherine Lawler with ARCHI.
Rick Aronson, United Way Grantee Board Liaison and CEO of Jewish Family and Career Services of Atlanta.
Ethan Henry, United Way, welcome.
Kesling Woodbury, Member Enterprises.
Atiba and B1, Zeiss Foundation.
Raphael Holloway, Gateway Center.
Katrina Mitchell, the Georgia Division of Family and Children Services.
Brittany Broaders, Gas South.
Aisha Williams, from the Westside Community Health Workers.
Hi, Audrey Jacobs. I'm an independent consultant.
Aisha Parham, Fatherhood Liaison for the CAB Access Resource Center.
Hi, good morning. I'm Lauren Baker with the Children's Museum of Atlanta.
Hi, Jeff Smythe with Lutheran Services of Georgia.
Good morning, Jean Yantz, Phoenix Pass, Supportive Housing for Homeless Women with Children, Rockdale County.
Abby Atkins with Phoenix Pass.
Good morning, Tanya Bose, Gateway Center.
My name is Faye Dresner. I'm with Jewish Family and Career Services.
I'm Christina DiGiulio, Atlanta Regional Commission and Learn for Life.
Good morning. My name is Yael Sherman. I'm with United Way of Greater Atlanta.
Good morning. I'm Vera Golden. I'm with Jewish Family and Career Services.
Hello, Donna Davidson, Easter Seals.
Good morning, Deborah Massey of Jewish Home Life Communities.
Good morning, Amanda Van Dalen, the Gateway Center.
Good morning, I'm Johnny Thomas with Children's Healthcare of Atlanta.
Noelle Davis with Playworks.
Good morning, Jackie George, Sickle Cell Foundation of Georgia.
Good morning, Cassandra Fraser, Junior League of Atlanta.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sojourner Marable Grimmett, National Church Residences.
Good morning, Monica Rogers, Imlin Consulting.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lydia Hederman, Education Coordinator at Atlanta Habitat for Humanity.
Good morning, Constance Franklin with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Lynn Turknett, here as a United Way volunteer.
Kelly Marshall, I'm with Esprit de Mercy, also a volunteer.
Good morning, I'm John Moeller. I'm the CEO of Lutheran Services of Georgia.
Good morning, I'm Catherine Bailey with Atlanta Habitat for Humanity.
Hi, I'm Christy Naylor with Cobb County Senior Services.
Good morning, I'm James Maynard from Cobb County Senior Services.
Good morning, I'm Barton Lowry from the Boy Scouts in Atlanta.
Hey, I'm Ashton Brasher from United Way.
Hannah Tweel, United Way.
Jane Hubbard, Independent Contractor.
Hi, I'm Armandi Drew with Giant Worldwide.
Good morning, I'm Patrice Holt with Start to Soar.
Good morning, I'm Rebecca Hudgens, Research and Evaluation Consultant with Georgia Family Connection Partnership.
Good morning, I'm Regina Jennings from Covenant House, Georgia.
Good morning, I'm Latoya Ferris, Coordinator of the Community Service Center, also with Covenant House, Georgia.
Good morning, Priscilla Moore from the United Way.
Good morning, Kim Anderson, Independent Consultant.
Good morning, Laura Keefe with YELS, or Youth Empowerment Through Learning, Leading, and Serving.
Good morning, Jerica Richardson. I'm Lady Ninja at Hackout Ninja.
Good morning, I'm Kathy Brown Bragg with Odyssey Family Counseling Center.
Good morning, Amy Mast, United Way of Greater Atlanta.
Good morning. I'm Ann Daney with United Way of Greater Atlanta.
Hello, I'm Jason Martin for Community Guilds in our Steam Truck program. I think you haven't had it.
Good morning, Melissa Austin with Lutheran Services of Georgia.
Good morning, Lori Anglade with SunTrust.
Good morning, I'm Bonnie Moskovich. I'm a clinical psychologist, independent practice.
Hey y'all, I'm M. Clark with the United Way of Greater Atlanta.
Good morning, everyone. Ebony Johnson, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Youth Spotting Program Coordinator.
Good morning, Ken Zeff, Learn for Life, the Metro Atlanta Regional Partnership.
Buenos días, Aníbal Torres, Latin American Association.
Good morning, Versandra Kenny Brew, AmeriCorps Vista at Yale's Youth Empowerment through Learning, Leading, and Serving.
Good morning, Billy Holly with the Metro Atlanta YMCA.
Good morning, Ed Munster, YMCA.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you, all of you, for being here this morning. It is now my pleasure to introduce an important person to our organization, Rick Aronson. Rick serves as our agency liaison, representing our partner agencies to the United Way Board of Directors. In that role, he acts as the voice of agencies that receive funding at our board meetings. Rick is the Chief Executive Officer of Jewish Family and Career Services of Atlanta, a non-sectarian human service agency that provides health, career, and social services to maximize the self-sufficiency and quality of life of over 14,000 people in Metro Atlanta annually. Rick assumed the CEO role in July 2015 after 11 years as the organization's COO. He leads with head and heart, blending business acumen and a mission-based focus on helping people in need on their journey to finding hope and opportunity. Rick's strategic priorities include a focus on impact, adaptability, and long-term sustainability, together with an innovative, collaborative approach to service and delivery. Please join me in welcoming Rick to the stage. Thanks, Rick.
Well, good morning, everybody. And I saw Milton sneak in. Hey, Milton, how are you doing? I actually forgot my suit coat at home this morning. I was going to borrow yours, Milton, but you were a little late. And I couldn't fit into it anyway. You're way too buff for me. Everyone, I really am delighted to be here this morning, and I'm truly honored to serve as your liaison to the United Way Board as grantee agencies. United Way really is committed to this child well-being movement, and United Way is committed to bringing us together so that we can have a deeper impact. At my organization, JF&CS, we recognize that we can do more by working together, working with each one of you and working as a community instead of as an individual organization. But like you, I'm sure that you know that this is much easier said than done. It requires a lot of intentionality, a lot of learning, and a lot of faith to move forward on collective impact initiatives. And that's why I'm personally grateful that Kathryn and Paul are here today to share their expertise with us. I have had the pleasure of working with Kathryn for many years and look forward to learning from her and from Paul. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce them. Katherine Lawler serves as the Executive Director of the Atlanta Regional Collaborative for Health Improvement. The acronym is ARCHI, without an E. Kathryn's 20-year career has focused on cross-sector interventions to address complex social problems. From her earliest days in downtown Atlanta as a case manager, her graduate school research, and her tenure in a variety of roles at the Atlanta Regional Commission, she has worked to bring together transportation, housing, and healthcare systems to support vulnerable populations. That's transportation, housing, and healthcare. No small task, and Kathryn has done an amazing job for our community. Most recently, Kathryn led a large team as manager of the Aging and Health Resources Division and director of the Area Agency on Aging for Metro Atlanta. Thank you for being here, Kathryn. We'll meet with Kathryn in just a moment. And now Paul. Through his consulting firm, Leading Inside Out, and his role as senior advisor to the Collective Impact Forum, Paul builds collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve a deeper social impact. He is faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, was a social innovation advisor to the Obama White House, and is the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. Paul lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and with his wife and 5 children. Paul, welcome to the podium, and thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone. So, first, it's great to be here in Atlanta, and it was funny when we were doing the introductions. It's amazing, just hearing the breadth of organizations. And I'm on the board of the United Way in Milwaukee, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but a big supporter of United Ways generally and the work that they're doing more and more to convene and build this kind of work. I'm also on the National Board of Playwork, so great to see you here too, Noel. So, another great organization. But what I've been asked to talk about is to really dig into what I've been learning about collective impact in my work around the country and around the world on it. But to get started, what I'd like you to do real quick is I'd like you at your tables, you have a task, and your task is to design the worst collaboration imaginable. So I'd like you to think just for a couple minutes, what would you put in place to create a team that was so bad that you spent more time in the parking lot complaining about it than you spent in the meetings, that every time you see it on your calendar you groan, and that you just hate? What could you put in place to create that team? Go. Are you All right. So let's get a sample of some of your greatest hits. What do we got? People that don't like each other. What else? Competing. People competing at the table. No clear direction. Say that again. Leading with the money. Lack of communication. Personal agendas. Lack of trust. Lack of diversity. The meetings are only on weekends and evenings? And no food. Right. So you guys would be really good at designing a really bad collaboration. But how many of you have experienced any of these things before on a team you've been part of? All right. So, and it goes back to that Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That you can develop a great structure and strategy and measurements and evidence-based programs, but if you don't build a culture to do it well, it's not going to work. And that's what I'm going to be kind of focused on today. And first I want to talk about just kind of how I kind of came into collective impact as part of something called the White House Council on Community Solutions. We were charged with finding how are communities solving problems. And initially people came to us and everyone said, let's find evidence-based programs in the country and scale them nationwide. And something was gnawing at me about that. And it really hit me in April of 2010. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the headline of our local newspaper that morning was we had the worst 4th grade reading scores for African American children in the country. That afternoon, I got a newsletter from the largest youth organization in the city boasting about all the outcomes it was achieving with the 15,000 children they serve. And that disconnect really hit me. And we had a conversation in our office. We talked about the just immense growth of youth development in the previous 20 years. The fact that all the groups were measuring outcomes, that we visit these programs, we see how good they are. But all of their work was adding up to this. And so I went back to the council and said, can we stop looking for the great programs? Let's look for a city where the reading score is up 30 points, or where infant mortality is down 1/4. But let's stop looking for organizations and let's start looking at and use the city as a unit of analysis. And right about the time that we started this exploration, this article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact, in which it coined the term. I mean, the important thing to understand is that John Caney and Mark Kramer did not invent collective impact. What they did is describe and put a framework around work that had organically grown in many parts of the country. And it was often groups, many of them United Ways, who were experiencing the same challenge. And our White House Council looked at 22 cities where we had seen a 10-point or more increase or decrease in a population level metric, and we found the same things that they found. And one of those was in Milwaukee, my hometown, on teen pregnancy. Our United Way and our city health department, Milwaukee was #1 or #2 in the country for over 2 decades on teen pregnancy. We were 2.5 times the national average. 2.5 times the national average. The city and the United Way brought all the groups together who worked on this for a summit, and the first thing they recognized is almost everyone who worked on the issue served girls, and they realized there was another part of the problem. But the other thing is they looked at data, and as they made sense of data together, one of the data points that shocked everybody, and no one seemed to know, is that the majority of teen births, the father was over 18. And they realized there was another problem in the community that no one was talking about or working on. Together, they identified 3 strategies, and they figured out how to do them at scale to really spread them to every young person in the community to be touched by this initiative. And one of those was an ad campaign. And they had a series of ads which were all over the city for years. And I have to ask you, which do you think was the most controversial ad? This is an Only in America story. There's an association of snake owners that want to increase the kinds and types of snakes that can be imported and held domestically as pets. And they don't like snakes represented in the media as predators. And so, like, this association of snake owners started protesting the United Way. And the United Way is doing all this other controversial work, and that was not where they expected it to happen. But the result of this is our teen pregnancy rate's down 70% in 10 years. We've gone from 2.5 times national average to national average in 10 years. So everyone says, well, the national numbers are wrong. You can see that graph's a few years old, but the national graph was going like that, the Milwaukee one like that. And that's what collective impact's about. It's not let's all work together and be nice and do some work together. It's let's work together to move population level results. That's what collective impact's about. And it begins with a shared sense of urgency that we feel that more and better of the status quo won't give us a different result than we have now. That all the work we're doing right now adds up to the result we have right now. So we have to have a sense of urgency that we have to do something completely different. There has to be stakeholder trust. And where there's not trust and there's competing agendas, we've got to work through them and repair that. Because if you don't build trust in a transparent process, it won't work. You have to have champions who can bring people to the table and neutral conveners that can hold the table. It gets hard. We make hard choices. There are competing interests, and you've got to have people who can facilitate and manage that. And if funders aren't aligned with the work, it's not going to happen. If funders are still doing RFPs to do individual grants to their favorite programs to do whatever they want and aren't aligning their work with the initiative, it's not going to work. So you have to have funders at the table as partners and willing to not only help design the process, but put their resources behind it. With that, there's the 5 elements we commonly think of as collective impact. One is there's a common agenda. It's a result-based strategy that really identifies what at scale needs to happen to move this result. If you're trying to move infant mortality in 7 zip codes where there's 14,000 women of childbearing age, you can't say, let's do a program for 50 people here and 100 here. The question is, what would it take to move the needle in this community at scale? And what all has to be done? The second is that you have shared measurement. You have ways of measuring success and performance as you go. And one of the critical things here is in the teen pregnancy example in Milwaukee, in the early years, the Latino rate was not going down as fast as the African American and white rates. And they knew that because they were looking at data in real time and disaggregating it and analyzing it and adapting strategies. So they created a task force and they created an entirely new set of strategies. And within a few years, the Latino rate went in line with the African American and white rates. And that's because they weren't just doing shared measurement to say, let's do a report at the end of the year. They were doing it to make real-time decisions and adapt strategy. You have mutually reinforced, we connect dots. We have so many times, we have similar organizations and programs serving the same neighborhoods, if not the same families, and they don't talk to each other. And if we're gonna solve systemic problems, we have to work as a system and start operating systemically. And there's gotta be continuous communication, ways in which we touch base and work together on a regular basis. And finally, there's this backbone that holds it all together, which is the idea that you have to have staff that manage the process and keep the process going and hold the sense of urgency, hold people accountable, make sure the work gets done, gather the data, do the facilitation, and keep the process moving. I was part of many collaboratives and coalitions in the past that had great intentions, but we often failed to get follow-up between meetings, and that backbone helps make sure that happens. But at the end of the day, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can do all of that, but if you don't address and build a leadership culture for this to work, it's not going to succeed. And that's where I want to spend the rest of my time today. And I want to start with, I wrote a book a few years ago, as I mentioned, called Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. And I have to be clear that does not mean that everyone should be in charge at the same time. What it does mean is that leadership's a muscle. And like every other muscle in our body, it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the important thing to understand is, one, that everyone has this muscle, can be developed among all people. And the second is that the only way to solve problems in a community is to build collective leadership muscle in organizations and communities. That's how we get collective impact. There has to be collective leadership. And the way that we came to define leadership was that first, it's an action everyone can do, not just a position few people can hold. When we shift our thinking from the noun to the verb, it really opens up the possibility of who can participate and what it means. The second is, if you think of what the essence of leadership is, it's essentially an act of responsibility. It's stepping up and saying, I own this result. I'm willing to do what it takes to get this done. And so you can't really be entitled to leadership or given leadership because it's something you have to own. It's something where you have to own a result and say, I'm willing to do what it takes to get this done. But then if you think about the difference between those leaders you most admire and like being on teams with or enjoyed working for, and those you don't, it's not usually how technically smart or skilled they were in their role. It's usually about whether they practice what they preach, they fulfill their commitments, they listen to other points of view, they're inclusive and collaborative. It's all about values. Yet so often when we talk about leadership, we talk about skills instead of values, but really the secret sauce of leadership is in values. And so I want to take this first idea of leadership as an action and share a story with you, and it's a story that you all know. I'm going to tell it to you in a way that perhaps you might not have heard it before, but to me it's one of the greatest examples of collective leadership and collective impact I can think of. And it's the story of Mrs. Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we have to start with Mrs. Parks. She was a lifelong rebel and radical who as a child got in fights when she was mistreated. She fell in love with her husband Raymond, who was a barber, because of his activism. He was involved in a case called the Scottsboro 9 case, and he became a community organizer in the effort. And she said he was the first man radical enough for her to marry. In 1942, they attended their first NAACP meeting because they found out that E.D. Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter. If elected, he'd be the first working-class president of an NAACP chapter in the country, and he had registered them to vote the summer before. And they were working-class people, and they thought the NAACP was for the elites. And they went to the meeting, and she was a seamstress, and he was a barber, and sure enough, Nixon was elected president, but no one ran that night to be secretary, and she was the only woman in the audience, and so she got railroaded in being secretary. She held that position for the next 12 years. And the important thing to ponder for a moment, it was her job, therefore, to document all of the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, and terrorism in the community for over a decade. She was the repository for all of the community stories. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings here in Georgia and in Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who was the national field director of the NAACP, who'd been building leaders throughout the South. And she became a mentor of Rosa Parks, and among other things, encouraged her to create a youth council in Montgomery, which she did, in which she worked with young people on how they could stand up to segregation. They would meet at her church on Sunday afternoons. Then one day she was working in her job as a seamstress for Clifford and Virginia Dewar, who were the town's leading white liberals. Clifford had been a New Deal lawyer in the Roosevelt administration, and his wife was an activist. And they were talking to her about her NAACP work when they recommended that she go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where they did trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists. And when she said she was interested, Virginia Dewar raised the money from her friends to sponsor Rosa Parks to go to Highlander, and actually took the bus with her there to make sure she got there safely. At Highlander, she was trained by Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who also became mentors of hers and began corresponding with her when she left about her activism and her work. And she said that Highlander had a profound impact on her. She said it was the first time in her life that she had been in an interracial environment in which everyone was treated equally, and it gave her a vision of the society she wanted to live in. Then a young lawyer moved to Montgomery, Fred Gray, who was 24 years old. He was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery and the second in the state of Alabama. And she took him under her wing, and every week she took him to lunch. And she would bring all these cases she'd been documenting for over a decade to see which could be turned into cases they could prosecute under law. Then in February of 1955, Claudette Colvin, who was 15 years old and a member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. How many people know her name? The lawyers, who were all men, decided she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was too poor. They said she was too dark-skinned. They said that she had allegedly resisted arrest. She was a tweener. There were rumors she was sexually active. And they didn't take her case. 8 months later, in October 1955, Mary Louise Smith, age 18, a former member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. How many people know her name? Once again, the lawyers decide that she's not sympathetic enough. They go to her home. They're very poor. Her father's very drunk. They decide she wouldn't be a case they could organize around. 6 weeks later, on Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. How many people have heard her name before? So the important thing to note is that when she died, a lot of the obituaries still said she was an accidental activist or inadvertently started a movement. How accidental does she sound at this point, right? So the other thing to note is it was the second time she had been thrown off that bus by that bus driver for refusing to move. It wasn't the first time she had stood up for herself. Edie Nixon and Clifford and Virginia Dewar go to get her out of jail, and they go back to their home, and they spend the next few hours talking about using her case as the one to take on segregation in Montgomery. And she and Raymond know they'll lose everything if they do this, but they make the courageous choice. And sure enough, they lost their jobs, they lost their home, they lost everything in the process. Then Edie Nixon called, sorry, I got blank there for a second. He called Fred Gray and asked him to represent his mentor in court that Monday, and then he called Joanna Robinson, who headed the Women's Political Council in Montgomery. The Women's Political Council was an association of African-American professional women, and for 2 years they had been urging the NAACP to organize a bus boycott. And he says, we're going to do a bus boycott Monday, can you get the word out? So Joanna Robinson, who's an English professor at Alabama State University, a historically black college, but a state institution, goes and overnight prints 15,000 flyers on state equipment using state ink and state paper, by the way. And if I had asked Tiffany to make copies for all of you last night, 15,000 flyers overnight on 1955 technology. 15,000. All the women met her that morning, and they fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with flyers announcing the boycott. And then, as many people know, this is how it happened. Edie Nixon called Ralph Abernathy at Holt Street Baptist Church and asked him to convene the pastors Friday afternoon for a meeting. So on Sunday, they would all call for a boycott from the pulpit. And he said, I've got a better idea. There's this new young pastor in town. Let's do the meeting at his church because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that's how 26-year-old Martin Luther King got drafted into the civil rights movement, right? And they met at his church that Friday afternoon, and they were all impressed. It was the first time most of the pastors met him. One white pastor attended the meeting, Robert Grates, who's still alive in Montgomery. And Robert Grates' home was bombed a week later when it was found out he attended the meeting. He was Rosa Parks' pastor. That's Monday, no one rode the buses, everyone marched. And the community kind of shocked itself. And they had a mass meeting that night at Holt Street Baptist Church, and the entire church was filled with people in all the streets outside. And they voted unanimously to continue the boycott, and they decided to create an organization that night, the Montgomery Improvement Association, to manage the boycott. And Rufus Lewis was a business owner, he was college educated, and he did not like Edie Nixon. He had lost several elections to Nixon to run the NAACP, and he didn't like the idea that he, a college-educated business owner, was losing to an unlearned reporter on trains. And he didn't want Nixon to run the Montgomery Improvement Association, so he gets before the audience that night with a scheme. He's a deacon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and he says the community is too divided and factionalized, and we need someone completely neutral to lead this process. And he recommends his young new pastor, Martin Luther King, as that person with hopes he can pull the strings behind the scenes. And that's how King becomes head of the Montgomery Improvement Association that night. King then calls his father here in Atlanta, who, as we all know, is a very prominent pastor, who connected into a pastor in Baton Rouge where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And that pastor said, well, people march for maybe a week, and then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. So King appointed Lewis transportation chair, and Lewis organized a 350-car carpool that transported the entire community to school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, 2 women, Inez Ricks and Georgia Gilmore, created competing clubs of women who made and sold food during the week, and they would compete every Monday to see who brought the most money to the mass meeting that went to pay for all the gas costs and the tickets the police kept giving the drivers. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. The Hordens and the Doers hit up the donors in the South that supported Highlander. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. Edie Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, whose leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really Dean of Civil Rights Leadership in the first half of the 20th century. His master organizer and strategist was Bayard Rustin. But Rustin was a controversial guy. He had been the campus organizer for the Communist Party of America in the 1930s. He had then gone to India to follow Gandhi. He sat out World War II in jail as a conscientious objector and pacifist, and he was an openly gay black man in 1955 with a thick New York Jamaican accent. They called him Brother Outsider. So he sends down Rustin, who is the master strategist of the movement, to go support Nixon. And Nixon tells him about this young new pastor, King. He goes to King's home with Nixon. King has a man stationed on his front porch with a shotgun. He has a man stationed on his roof with a shotgun. And Dr. King is carrying a sidearm. Up to that point, as they marched in Montgomery, they always marched with weapons to protect themselves against the white supremacists. And Rustin sits down with Nixon and King and talks about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. King had read Gandhi in graduate school and is interested. And Rustin said, first, get rid of the guns, no more marching with weapons. He said, secondly, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have now been indicted by the local police. Can you organize them all tomorrow to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail, and turn themselves in, which they did. But they were worried that this gay communist, pacifist, New York Jamaican guy is going to be found in Montgomery, so he moves into a hotel room in Birmingham, where he lives for the next year and coaches and counsels King and Nixon every day on helping build this. Then he and Ella Baker co-found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Ella Baker becomes its first executive director to create a platform coming out of Montgomery for the movement. But Rosa Parks had been an officer in the NAACP for over a decade, so they decided in the end that she also isn't a sympathetic enough figure to organize a case around, so yet another woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus and been arrested, Aurelia Browder, how many people know her name? It was her case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned segregation in the South. So the question is, who was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? It doesn't diminish the immense courage of Rosa Parks or genius of Dr. King to recognize that their leadership story was part of a network of leaders. That there were people who at various skill levels, networks, experiences, and roles could own their contribution to a collective result. That's collective leadership. And every leader plays roles, and they're different kinds of roles. But the question is, how are we creating space for all kinds of people to lead together? For people at various skill levels, roles, experiences, and networks to step forward together and own their contribution to result and be seen as leaders, not just participants in a movement to create collective change. The second thing I just want to briefly touch on is that there's 5 values that I've really emphasized in my work with communities around this. The first is being asset-based, is really understanding that for every one of us, the proverbial glass is half empty and half full, both. That every single one of us have gifts and talents that make us great family members, great friends, great workers, great leaders. We all have fullness, but every single one of us also has emptiness. We all have things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. We all have both. Yet community service is often people who've been defined by their fullness going into communities that have been defined by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness with the notion that our job is to fill them up with our fullness. We think that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. We think great leaders are those who, even when staring into a community or individual's emptiness, they find the fullness. They always start there. And if we do that, we start to recognize things differently in a community. We start to recognize that the woman who checks in on young mothers in the neighborhood is part of public health in our community. That the man who watches kids after school on the playground is part of youth development in our community. That when we think of who do we need to engage to solve a problem, we think creatively about who has relationships in neighborhoods, not what are the organizations and institutions in a neighborhood. That we think of community based on relationships, not based on infrastructures. And if we do that and we start to recognize those assets and see how people are connected and doing work with each other and realize that is our greatest asset, that so often what we miss is that families, friends, and neighbors are the #1 support and the #1 place to go if we're trying to create change in communities. The second is inclusion and equity, and what I argue there is there's been a lot of talk in nonprofits and philanthropy about having an equity lens. And we talk about disaggregating data, understanding disparities, and differentiating our work because we recognize that everyone starts in the same place, so to get to the same result, we have to invest differently. And that's been good, but I would argue just as important is an equity mirror. And that mirror asks, who's at the table? How many people at our table live in the neighborhoods that we're prioritizing and doing our work in? Or even have family members who live there? How many people have lived experience on the issues we're working on, or have family members with lived experience? How demographically reflective is our table of the neighborhoods and community population we're serving? Do we have people at our table who interact and work with that community every day? And I've been in a lot of communities where I see a table that's all on the outside of that. If we imagine our intended beneficiaries, the neighborhoods we work in, and the population we're serving at the center of that table, how close is our table to those people? Can we really say, therefore, that we have the best information about the community, the population, and the issue to make the best decisions, to interpret data correctly? I was just in a city where we had a group of civic leaders interpreting data on crime, and then we had folks from the community interpret that data. Completely different analysis of what was going on from the data. Still grounded in the same data. But what we forget is our interpretations are shaped by our own biases and experiences. And if we don't have diverse experiences at our table, we will be doomed in creating strategies that don't fit the context we're in. We need content expertise and context expertise to do this work. To collaborate, we have to understand that that collaboration moves at the speed of trust, and that if there's not trust in our group, we have to repair or build it. That means transparent processes. It means when we know there's competing agendas at the table, let's talk about them. It's hard, but we have to do it. We all know that Tim's at the table because he wants the grant. And we all talk about it outside. So let's talk about it inside. Tim, if you don't get the grant, is your organization still going to be at the table? Can you let us all know? Because we're all talking about that, so let's just ask. And really, the way I would grade is the absence of conflict is not a positive measure of collaboration. The question is whether it's the kind of constructive conflict where we give each other feedback, hold each other accountable, have competing ideas and debates, or whether we go to the parking lot and have all the conflict out there, which doesn't help anything. And so the grade of any collective effort is, are we moving the parking lot conversations into the room? And if we are, then we've built collaborative trust. We have to build an environment of learning because we have to be adaptive to do this work. Again, collective impact isn't, here's the 5 strategies and performance measures, we're just going to keep doing those no matter what. It means that we're looking at data regularly to assess, we're evaluating how we're doing, we're recognizing, do we have to shift our strategies? And we all have to come with the vulnerability and with the humility that our present efforts are producing the result we're trying to change. So no one can come in big in their britches. We all have to come with that vulnerability and willingness to learn, to fail, to be evaluated in front of each other, to have our data shared in front of everybody, because we're not here about our agencies, we're here to solve a problem. And so we have to create that learning environment. And finally is integrity, which is really about how we hold ourselves accountable to our own purpose and values, how we hold ourselves accountable to the people we're working with, and ultimately how we're holding ourselves accountable to the people on whose behalf we serve, and the data and results we're trying to achieve. And our integrity is how we hold all of that accountability together, our own backbone. And so if we can build leadership in a community at the table that's asset-based in how it engages and works with community, that's inclusive and recognizes that the table has to be equity, they have to be equity to do equity, that is collaborative and builds trust and transparent processes in an intentional way, that creates a learning environment where we can be vulnerable and share successes and failures and work through them and see failures as the step to getting to better success, and that we have accountability at every level and we hold everyone accountable. That's the culture that produces excellent collective impact. And that's what's needed. So if we think about leadership and culture as the ingredients, not just the 5 elements, not just a great strategy, but we have to build a leadership culture to do that. So thank you all very much, and I'm going to pass it over to our colleague.
Do I need the clicker?
No.
Thank you, Paul. That was fantastic. I am delighted to be here. Humbled to follow that, so we'll see how I do. But thank you, and more importantly, I think you'll enjoy the opportunity to be in dialogue with Paul as well, which will happen just shortly. So as Rick mentioned, my name's Katherine Lawler. I run the Atlanta Regional Collaborative for Health Improvement, which is a collaborative that has existed since 2012 and in its earliest days adopted the collective impact framework. So I wanted to just spend a couple minutes telling you the story of how that came together, and then I'm very comfortable being open and honest about where we are in this journey. So if I was supposed to be the example of collective impact going perfectly, they got the wrong speaker, right? I think that we've got a journey to take, and this is a whole new way of working, and part of it is that adaptive piece that Paul talked about, recognizing what's working, what isn't, and how many times we accidentally fall into an old way of doing things, which is so easy to do. So I want to go ahead and get started at the beginning. Why did ARCHI exist? A bunch of folks came together. United Way was one of the primary leaders, so was the Atlanta Regional Commission, Grady Hospital, Kaiser Permanente, and the Georgia Health Policy Center, and came together really for a very basic reason. A bunch of folks were required to pull together data on how we were doing in health in our metropolitan region, and all those organizations had to be a part of doing it and said, you know, I am so tired of pulling this data together to show that we are mildly better than Alabama, you know, that we are just shreds above Mississippi, that we are this major metropolitan area with world-class health institutions, and once again, our health outcomes are worse this year than last year. This has got to stop. And I guess that's some of that frustration that Paul talked about. There's this inherent inefficiency and ineffectiveness sometimes in what we're doing that says we've got to do some things differently. So real quickly, what did that data look like? I'll just show you. None of this is going to surprise you, but we're going to just look at the United States diabetes year over year from 94 forward. And keep your eye on our southern belt here and Georgia, and you'll see that really year over year, things are continuing to get worse at a pace that's unprecedented, just looking at this one chronic condition. And we know that there are many chronic conditions that are also in the same way. Here we are heading into this 21st century, this great time of opportunity when we have all these health lessons from the last century, and yet our data continues to get worse. And you see, for all these maps, it turns out red is bad and really dark red is worse. And Georgia hangs out in the darkest red parts. But we have a crisis in our country, and Georgia is certainly ground zero for some of these numbers. We'll finish up. So it's not going so well in some other areas, and many of you may have been involved, but Georgia also tends to hang in the bottom when it comes to the beginning of life, infant mortality. We have some of the worst infant mortality rates in the country, and parts of our metro region actually have infant mortality rates that are similar to communities around the world that have nowhere near the rate of development that we do. And when you jump ahead to the end of life, we have dramatic differences in life expectancy as well, right? So this is downtown Atlanta looking at life expectancy. How many years are you expected to live? And we see that people who live just a handful of miles, 2 or 3 miles from each other, can expect to live 10 years less than other folks. Remarkable in this major downtown metropolitan area with world-class health institutions. We are not in parts of Georgia where hospitals are closing. We are not in a community that doesn't have doctors and health clinics, and yet these are some of our statistics. And all of you know the child well-being numbers by now, right? So United Way has been shining the light on this as well. They said families are not doing well, kids are not doing well, and this disparity is tremendous across our region.
Well, part of the problem is that in Fulton and DeKalb alone, we spend $11 billion a year on healthcare, just straight up healthcare. So ARCHI came about and said, this is no longer acceptable. There are too many of us who find this data we can't live with, and recognizing that when you're spending $11 billion, you should be getting different results. Well, there's a problem in the way that we have historically addressed health challenges in our country and actually as human beings. When we go simple, things don't work. When we don't recognize the complexity of what's going on, we usually don't get great results. Just to give you some examples, in the past, we've had major health problems, and when we take a simple approach, whether it was cholera or the Black Plague, sometimes we start in health by blaming the individual. We make you a victim. We say things like, don't get wet, please breathe better air, get right with your God. This is how you'll solve your health problems. And we have this tendency to do that in health. But when we see change in health is when we actually recognize the complexity of what's going on. So the only formula that's ever worked in making health improvement is when we recognize that we need to address the science and we need to address where people live, right? So in the 20th century, we made huge advances in health because we did things like pasteurize milk and get health professionals to wear gloves, and we created antibiotics. But we also did things like build sewers and water treatment plants and provide work opportunities that weren't near as dangerous as others had been. So we addressed the science, and we changed the way that people live and the communities in which they live, and that's when we have gotten health results. So we get away from a simple silver bullet answer, and we embrace the complexity. And ARCHI said, unfortunately, we're going simple again. Our history of addressing health issues is repeating itself. We're doing that blame the victim thing. We're not addressing our health issues. And when we just look at diabetes, we tend to say, it's really your fault, hope you eat better, hope you exercise more. And it's that simple response, not recognizing the complexity, that's once again not working. So how can we own our numbers, own the fact that we have the resources, and do what has always worked, which is take the science and match it with the addressing where people live? And the science today tells us that healthcare is just a small part of what makes people healthy. It's all these other things that matters. It's the place you live. It's your economic opportunity. It's your educational attainment. These are critical to your health. This is new and emerging in the field of health, but it is the science that tells us what we need to do. So if what's going to be our winning formula moving forward, we're going to once again have to take the science and we have to match it with changes in the way that people have opportunities to live. So we need to make it easy to be healthy. We need to have places to be active and exercise, and we need to make sure that everyone has the economic opportunities that they need to move forward. So that was ARCHI's story. If we're going to do this right, we're not going to be simple. We're going to address the complexity of it. And that inherently said, if we're going to do that, then we're going to have to find a different way of working. And that different way of working, we found, was in collective impact. So the initial leadership of ARCHI made themselves students of a woman named Elinor Ostrom, who you should put on your Google list if you want. But many of her core theories and ideas really emerge in the practice of collective impact. And the reason she won the Nobel Prize is she had this very radical idea. And she said, so much of economic theory says human beings are really sort of self-centered. We take the goods that we need to survive. We aren't able to work together to do things. We have to protect our stuff from other people. And she came along. She was actually a non-economist, spent her whole life saying, that's actually not the only part of the story. There is instance after instance of when people come together for a collective benefit. They are even willing to have short-term loss and in order to achieve long-term gain. And it was so radical and so important, and she was so right that she won the Nobel Prize. So you can't argue with that. She was the first woman and the first non-economist to win the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way. So we made ourselves student of this work and said, well, why don't we start by reframing some of the questions? Rather than just saying, how can we change our health statistics, why don't we reframe some of these questions in light of this complexity? And really, I think what Paul said about leadership, how can we claim a different leadership role if we say we want to live healthier, more equitable lives, if we want to invest our savings that we can achieve so that this work is not over when a grant is done, that we are in it for the long haul, that we know that health is going to take a generation to change, and that health is actually the baseline condition for every other goal and hope we have for our society and our community here in Atlanta. We were focused also on this concept of building a common agenda. And I'll tell you, we had sort of a really interesting experience in doing that because we had the opportunity to work with a computer model. It was emerging out of a bunch of MIT scientists. It's called the Rethink Health model, where we were able to convene a room very similar to this with a large group of stakeholders and really explore what could we do in real time. It's a fun computer model. It's all based on the Atlanta region, and we could say, if we do X, what will happen in the short term, what will happen in the long term? If we do Y, what will happen? So that we could create, if we were going to take on this big complex issue, what should we focus on that would be the most effective? And out of that day, and out of the opportunity to work with that data and hear many different voices and many different opinions, and I can tell you some stories about that because there were a lot of arguments about what should happen, and eventually some people saying the computer was broken and all that sort of thing. But we eventually settled on what was adopted as the Atlanta transformation scenario because the data showed that if we could focus on these 7 things and we would commit to doing it for 28 years, over the life of a generation, we could really move the needle on health in our community. We could fundamentally see those arrows move in a different way. And they are basic things, and they reflect that complexity we talked about before. Family Pathways is about economic opportunity. It won't surprise you that we need insurance in order for people to have access to good health care. We need our healthcare system to be better coordinated, and it's got a lot of components to that. And then obviously we need it to be as easy as possible for people to live healthy lives and be disease-free. Part of it also says that this innovation stuff, if we're calling on people to do something differently, that we need to support them. So we can't just say, here's the destination, you really should get there, it's really important, have at it, that we are going to have to support people along that way, and we need to fund things that may not work the first time. We need to be risky and big ideas, and test things and break them and fix them and break them again. And we also need to change the way that healthcare dollars flow in this country, and that's a whole lecture for another day, but if you're interested, we can talk about it. But it won't surprise you to know that healthcare funding in the United States is not really working in the right direction. The way that we began to embrace collective impact was one to say, we're not going to create a massive organization. We're not going to bring together $300 million and disperse it all out. The idea is to harness this collective power, all of those ideas and that energy, and make it easy for people to collaborate. Collaborate is a wonderful word. Every single one of you are great at peppering it in every 3 sentences in your grant applications. You give it in your speeches. I hope it's in your mission statement. But we know that going from saying it to doing it is really serious work, and it's really hard. And sometimes everyday life doesn't reward collaboration. It'd be much easier to be in a room and make decisions by yourself. So we try to create an unbiased platform where it's easy for people to come together because we believe that healthcare and health challenges cannot just be fixed by people who have health in their title or in their organization. It has to be easy for people to talk across sector. It's one thing to say, oh, we really want to work across disciplines, but I just spent an hour with a bunch of people and I didn't understand a word they said. It doesn't really lead to working together when that's over. We want to incentivize that, and we have to activate it. So sometimes you need a first mover, and if that first mover, if nobody, you've been one of those volunteers who didn't volunteer, it's just that you realized everybody took a step back and you were the only one moving forward. Well, ARCHI says, okay, we'll be the one who is left there standing alone sometimes, if that's what we need to do. Because we are everyone together. But if there needs to be that first mover, we can do that, as long as it's always understood that that's all we're doing, incubating and getting things started. And one of the areas that we are absolutely committed to, but continue to be challenged by, is really this measurement. We have to demonstrate that this works. It is great to talk about, but you know how it is. We have to have data to show that it is better to work in this way than working alone, and that continues to be one of the areas that we work on, but haven't completely figured out. So we know that the results that we can achieve, we know what those numbers are because I mentioned we have that fancy computer model that backs us up and a bunch of scientists who will say, but it also makes us accountable because we're not just trying to make incremental change. We have a big vision, we have 28 years to get it done, and we've got numbers that we need to hit. So real last, everyone says, well, what do you actually do? We have a 3-prong approach. We work with communities in all of those red areas to help them identify their community priorities and then match resources that they may not have access to do that. So we have a portfolio of communities that we work in order to make that kind of change, because that's the only way that real health change will take hold. But we also recognize that not every problem in the health system can be fixed neighborhood by neighborhood. So we work intensely with all the major health systems and insurance companies in our region to change the way they work as well, challenging them to transform their systems. And lastly, we are very focused in on making sure that this money works differently. So when you achieve health savings, that money needs to fund health improvement on an ongoing basis. It can't just be pocketed by those who achieve those savings. So we have a model, a financial model around how to do that and challenge people to come to the table to do it. So I want to really bring Paul back up here so we can engage in conversation. But that's been our journey so far. It's been powerful, and I would say that it is always wonderful to be here and grateful for United Way's leadership, because Paul's comments about culture are essential. And the culture for us in Atlanta is those of us gathered here. That if we are sort of saying, hey, have at it, but we're not all in it together, if we're not actively all part of changing the culture towards collective impact, then we aren't necessarily, it's not going to work for any of us. So I'm thrilled to be here and can't wait to hear more from Paul. Thanks. Okay.
I'm going to be the arbiter and sit in the middle. So again, I'm Aoife Henry, Executive Vice President at the United Way of Greater Atlanta. And this has just been such a tremendous presentation by both Paul and, of course, Kathryn, who I spend a lot of time with, and get the benefit of a lot of her knowledge and experience. But just listening this morning, Paul and Kathryn, and Paul has really encapsulated all of the stuff that we need to be thinking about around this child well-being movement. But as both of them have said, it's very easy to articulate all of this stuff, but very, very difficult to do. Yeah. In past meetings, what we have done is that the facilitator here has talked with our speakers, and then we have left you about 10 minutes for questions, and sometimes you get 2 questions in. So today we have decided to do it differently. Because this is so important, we want to really leave the time for the audience. So I hope you have been taking notes furiously, or if you're one of these people who can stand up and remember everything that was said and articulate it back in perfect paragraphs, then you don't need to take notes. But I am going to, at this point in time, just ask one question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Paul, you have really talked about culture and leadership, and I just wanted you to say a little bit more about how does one get started? You're in a community where in the past you have been working in your own silos. What are the first steps about how you begin to recognize and bring people together in a different way, in sort of a practical way? Where does one start to do that kind of work? How does the shift take place, since this is not usually the way in which we are working, either at the community level or even from a funder's perspective? As a funder, you want to make that shift. How does that look?
So there are 2 parts to that. The first is I would try to create a style of meeting and gathering, what we might call the container for it, the where you meet, how it's facilitated, that doesn't look like anything people have done before. Because that starts to signal that this is going to be different. And then secondly is I would work with the group up front to define the culture. That little activity I did at the beginning is a great activity to use to come up with the list of what we don't want. And then you come up with, okay, what are the list of things that would prevent those things? And let's get that commitment. But I think that the other piece of this, I guess, is a third piece, which is the result has to be compelling enough, and people have to get to a point where they understand that our work together is producing the result we have today. That no one can come in and say, I'm the best organization in town, because guess what? You're not. Your organizations collectively are producing the result we have today. And if we're not happy with that result, then we have to be willing to come in with that joint humility. And for us to come to the table and be held at the table and to call people out in a way, and this is where it gets sticky, that if you're not willing to be at the table, what you're saying is your organization's more important than solving this problem. Because we're coming to the table because we see, and I'll just make it up, I don't know your stats, but if half the kids are dropping out of high school, if we're all comfortable with that, then let's keep doing exactly what we're doing now and achieving outcomes individually. But if we're going to come to the table on that, that becomes what holds us at the tables. We're not at the table about our organizations. We're at the table because we collectively know that that's the only way we're going to make change in that number is if we work together. So holding that result, creating a container, a way of meeting, a style of meeting, a process that's different than anything you've done before, and then defining a culture together that you're going to all be accountable to, and that the facilitators and leaders of process will hold you accountable to. If you make those decisions and they go away, it doesn't work. It has to be something that's held front and center every meeting.
Oh, I forgot. I do have a mic. Well, I think that what Paul is saying is very true. And I'll just say that in my own experience with ARCHI, so I started with ARCHI on the leadership team. I was part of the meeting that came together that said, who's embarrassed to publish this data again? And I worked at the Atlanta Regional Commission then. And I used to say all the time to my boss, who would say, and you're doing that in addition to everything else? You know, why are you going to those meetings? I would say, because it's really different this time. There's a group of people who have been around the block who are tired of repeating the same cycle. And I used to say to him, don't worry, my biggest concern is that I am getting more for our organization than I'm giving to the collaborative. And it was so profoundly, that difference that Paul was talking about was so clear from day one. And there was a group that said, we will meet every month. It was every Tuesday, and I can tell you, it was at 7 o'clock at this Panera Bread, and my kids were even littler then, and it was not easy, so that's how I can tell you. We said, no matter what happens, we will always meet, and we will make sure that the group next month is ready to move forward. And there were a couple things. One, we did get some stuff done at Panera Bread, and we also, that commitment was so different to the rest of the group that they said, if these guys are going to keep doing it, it wasn't like that excuse, oh, sorry, I didn't do my homework last month, and then it sort of, everyone said, this is something else. So I think your point is very well taken.
Thank you. Okay, so I gave you your notice, and we're ready. Who has the first question? Right here. Could you just remind us where you're from again? Mike coming your way.
Hi again, everybody. Ebony Johnson, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Hughes Spalding. I want to first thank you both for being here. It was quite insightful, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. My question is for Paul. Under practicing values, one of your second point was inclusion and equity, and so I wanted to hit on inclusion. All too often we hear people use inclusion and diversity interchangeably, but we know they're not actually the same. So I just wanted to know if you could speak more to what inclusion actually is and why it's so important.
So again, I would go back to that point about you can't do it unless you be it, right? So the way I tend to think about it, again, is if we imagine that, we used to have a thing we talk about at Public Allies where we'd imagine if the young people in our program were sitting in a fishbowl watching our meeting, would they feel like we're doing a good job representing their interests? And I think that's a good question for any group to ask. And the reality is that if your table doesn't include people who have actual, again, some combination of lived experience, direct work, demographic experience, whatever, but that are part of the population, the neighborhoods, and the issue you're working on, you're not being inclusive. And you're not going to have all the best information you need to make decisions. So to me, it's the imperative is we're trying to solve problems in communities, and if our table isn't connected to that community, we're not going to make good decisions, and we're not going to be able to do that. And so that's how I tend to approach it, and I think that what I find around some of the conversations is people have found ways to proxy diversity around we're interested in all kinds of diversity, right? And my question is, where are the disparities? And that should drive where you focus your effort. And so the demographics of a community and the disparities should drive who's at the table.
Again, thank you very much. I'm Jean Yantz with Phoenix Pass Supportive Housing for Homeless Women with Children. I have a very simple question. We are actually doing what you have done. It's not through Phoenix Pass, it's through an organization, a community organization called Restoration Storehouse. And we are one of many partners in our community. We're the second smallest community in the state of Georgia. We have 500 nonprofits in our tiny community. Yes, so we all fight for the same dollars and all of that. My question is simple. How long did it take you to get that group really active and on the right path? We've been meeting for almost a year now. It's been in process for 20 years. 20 years it has been in process. It is finally coming to fruition, but it's been a long ride. And for those of us that have been involved for 30 years, it's really a long ride. Now, we're still hanging in there, and we're still going, but we fight every day. Much of what you said, the diversity issue, now we're diversified, very diversified, but the diversity comes into who is going to be a core partner, who is going to be a collaborative partner, and who's going to be a community partner. So how long did it take you to bring all of that to fruition?
So I think that, so we just did the Collective Impact Forum where I serve as senior advisor, which is an open network. Anyone can join the Collective Impact Forum. It's free, it's an online resource place. We have events and things. It's just a field building entity. We have 24,000 members around the world, and we do events. We just had our annual conference 2 weeks ago in Austin, which Tiffany and some other people were at. And I think that what we know we recently hired 2 evaluation companies to do a big evaluation study of collective impact. And one of the consulting groups or the evaluation groups was a known and published skeptic of collective impact, which is one of the reasons why we brought them in. And they looked at 25 cities that had had substantial population change, and they did this process tracing to look back to see what is the contribution of collective impact to that. And it's all available now. It's a great study, and I think very instructive. But one of the key points they make is it is a long-haul proposition. That if you're thinking in 3-year grant cycles and want to do collective impact, don't do it. It takes 1 to 3 years just to get like the process together and to get people moving together. And that's if you've got really good facilitation. You're talking about a major structural and cultural change in how people work, how organizations work, how philanthropy is given. There's so many changes involved with just that part of it. It takes time for that to happen. So it's not unusual. I think the challenge is holding this kind of sense of what we call patient urgency, which is how to be patient while you're still gaining momentum. And so what are the early wins we can do? What are the actions we can do so that those who need to feel like we're getting something done, you can give them something to get done? But you can get lost in being too patient. And so I always argue if half the people think we're moving too slow and the other half think we're moving too fast, we're probably exactly the right speed. Because there are people who want to like act. And you know, we had this great speaker at our conference, Brene Brown, who talks about vulnerability and courage, and she was just amazing. And one of the things she had this quote from Einstein that if he had 60 minutes to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes on defining the problem and 5 on solving it. And I think that's very true in this process, that you have to, if you don't spend the time really digging in to what are the true factors that at scale can move the needle and move out of just what everyone's assumptions are about what they're already doing, but really move into, You know, just a quick example is on infant mortality. Before we started the initiative the United Way is leading in Milwaukee, a lot of the effort was driven at safe sleep. Makes sense, right? Except for that 60% of infant mortality is prematurity, 25% birth defects, 15% sleep and other causes at home. Our state legislature was trying to pass a bill to make it murder if a baby died in bed with a parent and the parent had alcohol or drugs in their system. We were able to identify that's about one a year. But that one's in the paper, right? So let's pass a bill, but let's all the others, that's okay. We're not going to pass a bill around that stuff because that's hard, right? But the point is, a lot of the resources and a lot of the groups were organized around that and around other things that people had an idea. They started an organization. It made logical sense. But when we actually dug into what are the factors that could drive this number down, it wasn't what people were already doing. And that's why you have to really dig into the problem and have good evidence and work to get people connected and have people analyzing information together to figure out what would it really take to move the needle. In the case of infant mortality, yeah, we want to promote safe sleep, but driving down prematurity is the answer in our city. And that's way more complex, and that's not how the field was organized around that work. So it caused people to do, and it takes time to get everyone there. It took time to convince our legislators that, like, this is really the issue, not that. And so you have to change narratives, you have to change the way people are aligned, you have to change power structures, you've got to look at rule changes and policy changes. It takes time. The teen pregnancy effort has been going on now 12 years. And the United Way first made a 7-year pledge to it, and then at the end of 7 years made a second 7-year pledge to it. We're talking 14-year initiative now. That's not how funders typically work, but that's what it takes.
I just wanted to add that I think that whole last part of what Paul said about being really attuned to the external forces that are reinforcing old behavior rather than new is a real important part. So we focus on the agenda, we focus on the data, but if we don't recognize that everybody is responding to other forces that are keeping them in their old ways of working, it really is, it's not just, it's frustration. I mean, I think that patience and urgency is a perfect way of describing it, but let's also not shoot ourselves in the foot here and recognize what's going on. Paul's example from, the statistic coming out in Minnesota about all these kids and was their graduation reading levels?
Yes.
And the next day he gets an email bragging about, the work that this one organization is doing. There's something going on there that disconnect isn't recognized. So so just to second that bit about it's hard because you're already doing enough, but if the external world is pushing against you, let's see how we can get it moving in that way. Funders, policy, all those things he mentioned.
Hi, I'm Christy with Cobb Senior Services. I just wanted to get your input on, say, like Sustainable Cleveland 20, what were they shooting for, 2018, 2020, something. Anyway, it was a decade-long, multi-year collective impact idea, but each year they took a different focus. Would you say that's a good model, is to pull everybody in on
I don't know anything about it. So here's something I'll say, though. I think too much of collective impact focus has been on the recipe and not on the result. So people say, oh, this is a great collective, see, they have common agenda. No, what I want to know is the needle moving? So the question I would have for Cleveland is, show me the data. Show me what needles you've moved in the city. Not how you've organized and created common agendas and shared measurement. Like, I go to a lot of communities and they show me they've like done the recipe. But I would say the recipe to me is adaptable. The question is, what will it take to move the result? That's what collective impact's about. It's about the impact, not about the collective. The collective is the means to impact.
I'm sorry, Kathryn.
No, I really would like to add to that because we have to be super savvy about doing long-term work. So I argue all the time that if I got up and said ARCHI's going to change health outcomes in Fulton and DeKalb counties in the next 3 years, people should escort me out of the room. It doesn't even pass the smell test.
Right.
So that's a problem, and we should hold each other accountable to that. But on the other hand, when I say we are committed to 28 years, everyone gasps a little bit and says, are you kidding me? And then I know they're calculating how old I'm going to be in 28 years and wondering about that. But here's the thing. So being savvy in this, we're going to have to supply people with energy throughout that time period. And there are activities that we may need to do, goals that we need to pursue that are important and don't do harm and probably do some good, but never losing sight that we did them to build momentum. So if we have a focus and there's a short-term campaign, let's not pretend that that's the long-term work. Let's be real honest that we're doing that to keep people at the table, to build the momentum, and do some good things, you know. Plant some trees, get some things that we can count on. We can show you a picture of a before and after today. But it's the mixing it up, I think, when we get into trouble, when we count the momentum as somehow the long-term work. But we also have to be stewards of that momentum if we're we can't act like everyone can start running a marathon tomorrow and be mad when they're exhausted at mile 5, right, and they quit. So, I think that's somewhere some of that confusion comes in. And it's our job as leaders and be super savvy and be stewards of it and do what we need to do when we need to do it without losing the long-term vision.
That intentionality, it's really key.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I know that, Kathryn, you have done some good work around sort of prototyping, like how do you have small initiatives in the community that can provide us actually with some data and information and experience, as you're saying, to connect to the longer journey. And so I definitely would say that's a critical piece in sort of those long-term strategies. And I'm going to go right over here.
Whoops, I think there's someone right behind you, and then you're next.
Hopefully this one's
She's got a mic.
Hopefully this one's quick and easy. But do either of you have you ever worked with a hackathon? And what would be the recommendations for making a sustainable effort after the hackathon if you have? Okay, thank you.
I've been hacked, but I haven't done a hackathon. But I think, again, I think form follows function. So the question is, if a group is facing a challenge in which that could be a tool to help them solve part of it, you know, we should be learning lots of different tools. Like, I think sometimes people like human-centered design and prototyping is great. But sometimes people start with that rather than start with what are we trying to do, and does that actually, could that be an accelerator or support for part of our approach to get there? And I think sometimes people focus on, again, the recipes and the tools versus first figuring out what are we trying to do and then finding the right mix of tools and processes and systems to do. So I think it can be great depending on what it was. Again, I don't really know what it is, but I've heard of it, but I've never been to one or whatever.
Do you have a follow-up to this? No. No, okay, then we need to go over here first, and then we'll come back to yours.
That's right.
So my question, I'm a little nervous to ask, but I will anyway. Do you think that there are too many nonprofits? And the reason why I ask is, as a fairly new nonprofit, I can say, oh, there's too many of you. There's 500. That's insane. In about 5 years, when I'm on the other side, I'm like, there's too many new nonprofits. You know, we don't need to. We have what we have. So, yeah, are there too many nonprofits? And if so, what do we need to do about that?
So I have two responses to that. Are there too many businesses in America? Like, I always love how, people, never say, they say, oh, there's too many nonprofits. They never say, there's too many businesses. Right? I mean, they don't. So that's one part of the answer. And the other part of the answer is we have no incentives for mergers and acquisitions and things like that. And my organization did some M&A, and it was very hard to get it funded. And we were in one city, in our Silicon Valley office did it, and there was actually a fund there that supported organizations that were considering doing that and actually funded both the exploration process and operating grants for the afterwards. And it was great, and it allowed organizations to consider that because it is impossible in the current philanthropic environment to really do, it's really hard. And so I think that one is, I think sometimes that's just the question is, are there good and bad organizations? Yes. Are there ones that are less effective? Sure. Should they not be supported? Probably. But there's lots of bad businesses too. I mean, I think that's a little bit of a weird argument, but then
On the other hand, it's like we certainly need better incentives and financing to make it possible, because there are a lot of ways organizations should combine, but it's almost impossible in the philanthropic environment for them to have the time to do the proper exploration on it.
It's so interesting that we were talking about that. I was at a meeting last week where someone got up and, you go to meetings and you're sort of waiting for someone to say something new. And she said, talked about the nonprofit industrial complex and kind of gave this whole speech about her answer to that would be yes, there was way too many. And I hadn't even heard that phrase before and was really jarred by the whole thing. I think that, Paul is the expert, so he said everything that's right to say. I think that the answer has to also be that we, as happen to be nonprofits, are only the means and not the end in and of itself. So the only way to answer the question is going back to some of the things he said earlier, the real question is, are we achieving our goals and are we having our impact? And if we're doing that with 500, so what? If we're doing it with 2, so what? But when we, as organizations, become the end is the real challenge. And I think all that he also said, I couldn't underscore more, the incentives to start up a nonprofit versus, I wish the question was, why aren't there more long-term funding mechanisms so that people could have long-term goals and long-term vision and long-term programs? And if that would be the framework we could start from.
Vu Le, who writes a blog called Nonprofit AF, and it's a great blog, and he's just great, but he calls it My God, multi-year general operating dollars. And he says what nonprofits need is my God. But to do this work, that's often an important ingredient. I just want to take issue with the expert comment that I think I'm a steward of learning and an explorer more than, we're all learning this stuff as we go.
Thanks. Audrey Jacobs, and I just have a quick question. To Paul, would you, if you wouldn't mind, at least talk about your thoughts on Collective Impact 3.0?
Can someone hand me the thing?
Thank you.
Yes. So again, I'm not like orthodox about you have to do it this way, right? It's like, what would it take? And I think that the things that I see here look like better, more nuanced definitions of what's in so-called 2.0. Like definitely like the container piece. I even used that language earlier, but so I think that all of this is good. And again, I think the question is, what are you trying to solve? And what's the best way to get there? And which set of things? And how do you get nuance and depth in any of these to do them right? Because again, it's not like a recipe you can just follow. It's something that has to be somewhat adaptive. It's why I always tell that story about the Latino teen pregnancy rate in Milwaukee, because it's just that point of you're not just creating a strategy and running, you're making a strategy and then learning and adapting as you go. And I know Milwaukee right now, again, as a board member of the United Way, and I'm on the steering committee of a couple of the initiatives, the STDs are rising among teens, and that's leading them to think that some of the contraceptive work they're doing in the teen pregnancy thing isn't working exactly right, and so they're adapting their strategy again. And so, again, it's that idea that you're adaptive in this work and not fixed, because you're always focused on the result, not just the performance of strategy.
Raphael Holloway, Gateway Center. I have a question for Paul. Well, actually, kind of restating something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned culture. And running the Gateway Center is an organization that started about 13 years ago. And I don't know if they called it a collective impact model, but basically that's what it is. And that's the direction we've been going. And as you establish a culture over time in that 13 years, you add new partners based on what the data is saying and the need, which creates a culture shift. How have you seen culture shifts either help or sidetrack organizations trying to work on collective impact?
Right, there's that saying that if you bring new people to the table itself changes. And that has to do with both inclusion and also with collaboration, right? So if you keep adding people to the table, but you're saying this is our table and this is the way it is, that doesn't really work, right? That's not inclusive and that's not collaborative. And so I do think that there are some core principles of the work that you're bringing people into, but as you bring people in, you get a chance to rethink some of that and bring their points of view into the process. So I think that typically is the case. At the same time, people can disrupt that. Like I've been in a process where someone wants to revisit every decision made over 13 years, and that doesn't help. And it's not productive, and it won't move us forward. And so we have to create some room for people to help us adapt to the new perspectives and voices and partners, but they also have to respect the work that's been done in the past and not just think that, like, well, because I wasn't here, none of it counts. We have to build on what's been done and honor that work while we also continue to adapt.
Can I offer maybe just an example? So I mentioned Elinor Ostrom, and a lot of her, I'll be frank with you, articles are really for academics. So don't get too frustrated. They're tough. But not fun to read. But she does have these 8 elements of collaborative governance. And I think a fun story, so she went and documented how communities were managing fisheries and all these natural resources through this, so it's complex. But as a real researcher, she decided to run her own experiment in her the team that she was on at Indiana University. And they had a common problem, which is not unique, that the shared kitchen was always a disaster. So no matter how many signs people would put up to say, cover your stuff in the microwave, that some random person, a gremlin at night, was blowing up their spaghetti in the microwave or whatever. So they started a process where they created a series of rules, and there was actually a wooden spoon, and it would end up in your mailbox on the week that you were in charge of cleaning the kitchen. So very quickly, people started behaving better in the kitchen because they didn't like it when everybody else didn't. But they also knew who was in charge of cleaning that week, and they also had sanctions if you didn't follow through on your cleaning. So if you were out of town at a conference, you still had to find a substitute for your cleaning duties and such. So and of course, immediately, the work became very different. It wasn't even that hard to keep the kitchen clean because it changed everyone's behavior. It's a silly example, but the point is I think that it is important to have stated norms. And it's not that those norms can't evolve over time, but she has lots of evidence that works, and it's okay to invite people in. And there's nothing like you've got this great team, and then you bring a new partner, and their way of participating is to never show up for the meetings. Or if it really bothers everybody that they come 30 minutes late, every time. Or if so it's okay to have some norms and say, when you don't show up 2 meetings in a row, we have a norm that we call you and find out what went on. And it's okay if you were sick or whatever. So I think it's important to be organic and let it evolve, but there's also, it's all right to have some rules as long as you're willing to change those and let them reflect and, think about the microwave and the exploding spaghetti sometimes. And who solved that issue? Well, she got the Nobel Prize for doing it, so.
I solved that with my roommates in college. I didn't get anything.
You didn't get
Your fame was to come later.
Yeah.
Good morning. Atiba and Biwan with the Zeiss Foundation. We have made some My God grants in the realm of school-based health centers over the past 24 years in Georgia. But I would say the key to that has been continuous leadership. And last night I was at a dinner for Georgia Appleseed with Kim Anderson, and it's a collective impact organization, and it was a leadership transition that took place that was very organized, succession plan. I've known both of you all on the stage for over 20 years, and I think even your examples around the Rosa Parks, there was a picture of Vernon Johns that wasn't up there, who Martin Luther King succeeded unknowingly. And I'm just wondering, this question of succession planning for that 28-year cycle, what are your thoughts about how to incorporate that into this collective impact model so that we don't lose a lot of momentum along the way?
I'll go first.
Sure. I think that, I want to just be really honest about this. I think it's a kind of leadership that we are being called to do that is inspired by many of the trends of the past, but is in fact something new and different. Because momentum and a movement does require inspiration and excitement and the charisma and personality. I mean, Paul's example is so amazing. We could have had him talk all morning about that story just in a town not that far away. And so it does need to have personality involved with it and names and people you can point to. But we've all seen a way that that is done that ends up being about that person and not the movement itself. And so I think really stewarding that is a constant and ever-evolving process. And the best way I know that we're going to develop that kind of leadership in a real way, because Atlanta, I'll be honest, we love having supermen come in and save us. And we have these names for them, and we tell heroic leadership stories. It's part of our community's narrative, and we all know them, and we have a handful that we probably all have memorized, the same ones. We like having the person have a name and an address and the thing that they do, and they're the reason why we got something done in Atlanta. And so if we're gonna steward a new way of doing it, I think it's important to have a group around you, because you all are leaders who are gonna hold us accountable for both. So being inspiring enough that we have the momentum of a movement, but having a group to say, you know, we've lost some folks. There's nobody standing behind us. This isn't a movement anymore. You know, so I think it's going to have to be this iterative, almost like call and response. Like we take a step forward and make sure that we are still going as a movement, and recognize that we are bucking the trend in Atlanta, because people will want to turn you and your organizations into heroic leaders, because it's a simpler story to tell. Yeah. So I don't have a perfect answer on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I always joke that if you went to a Hollywood producer and said, I want to make a movie with 14 protagonists, and you're right, I could make that circle twice as wide. And they would say, that's insane. You got to have one person, they have to have the hero, they got to come up from under, you got to have the hero's journey. And so we love those stories, and that tends to define things. I think in a collective work, so I was part of one where we had an unplanned succession, where I was a steering committee member, but the collective leadership carried it through. And I think, you know, a great collective impact backbone leader is not the CEO of the collective impact, they're the chief facilitator of it. And if they're playing their role properly, there are lots of people leading in the effort and lots of people to look to. And there are different roles. You do need roles of people who can be that kind of force behind it. Sometimes that becomes a steering committee chair. Sometimes that is the backbone leader. Sometimes it's a number of people. But you have to have different roles. But I think that ideally you've got enough collective leadership that it's not relying on that one person. And but it is something that if you're in the long haul, you know, you do have to be prepared for. And because you're probably not going to have the same leader in 28 years or 10 years or 14 years. That would be highly unlikely. Possible, but unlikely.
Do we have...
Over here.
Yes. And I think we have time for maybe how many more questions? Two? Two?
All right, so we have one here and then.
Hello, good morning. My name is Suzanne Keelan. I'm with the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services. And Kathryn, at the beginning of your presentation, you showed us the figures on just how diabetes is developing. What could we collectively start including in our youth programs that could help families? Because for child well-being, if the parents are getting more and more sick, then our children are in peril. And if I'm way off the mark, and this is not a forum for a medical question, can you point me in the direction of where I could get some more? Because my community is at risk.
Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of great information, and I'm happy to follow up with you afterward. But I think the primary message for today on a topic like that is that there are a lot of forces at play, and it just emerges in a diabetes statistic. And so in order, which is also a very real disease and a problem, but it is not A plus B equals those statistics. There's a lot of things at play. So, you know, for example, if we are continuing to lecture moms healthy eating behaviors, but she still has to take 3 buses to her job on the way there and on the way back. We cannot be shocked if she's going to stop by a convenience store rather than go to Whole Foods to get dinner that night for her family. And so there is a system at play. So education is a critical part of it, but we know that those diabetes numbers are multiple failures throughout our community that start in the way that we've set people up. That isn't to say, like, hey, good luck with that, because that's not what it's just that we have to recognize the complexity and then get right back at the work. And so, but I'd be happy to follow up with you more specifically.
I think there was another question.
There's one last here. Laura, there's one right behind you.
So my name is Deborah Massley, and I'm involved in a collective impact-ish organization working with the senior community in Atlanta. I appreciate what you've outlined, the complexities of bringing different organizations with different objectives together and working through balance. I wonder what your best practices or your recommendations would be when you also add that each one of those organizations has a board of directors that has their own mission and they're there for that particular agency's goals. How do you bring them along as well?
I'll start. I think that if the board of directors is still measuring the organization's success on things that they can do by themselves, then they're sort of joking about collective impact. They're not going to be serious. Once they start to change the metrics for their organization that inherently require collective work, the rest will start to follow. And metrics can be broad as well as like data, like a number. But if success is still, we can do everything in our house, these are the things that we've always done, and that's how we feel successful, and this other stuff is extra, then I think that that's where the challenge comes in.
I couldn't agree more. I think that if they're still operating on the idea that if we help 50 kids, that's good enough, or would they actually care more if we actually helped improve graduation rates or reduce diabetes or whatever the case is, it's getting them to think about the issue they're trying to contribute to solving rather than thinking about the outcomes of an agency.
I think we have time for one more.
Well, there's one over here.
Yes, Katrina Mitchell from the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services. So my question is back to the leadership question about how do you build a leadership pipeline of leaders in different sectors to be able to do this collective work. I've had the pleasure of working in nonprofit and philanthropy and now public sector, but if you don't have that, how do you build that muscle within systems so that you do have leaders who can actually do this work and do it well?
That's great. I think capacity building is a key to this, and that there is leadership development that needs to be done because it requires a different way of leading. And so I think that if we're expecting people to change behaviors and ways of working and ways of leading, but we're just saying do it, that's hard. And so ideally, the group that is convening, as part of their backboning, it has to do capacity building of the field to help them lead in a different kind of way and do that work differently and create the culture and support kind of the leadership development necessary to do that. And I think communities generally can do a better job. It's interesting, there's a city, Allentown, Pennsylvania, there's a foundation that works with its United Way. It's United Way is doing collective work. This foundation basically has moved its dollars to creating a fellowship program for mid-career nonprofit leaders and public leaders to go through a cohort experience together to build the conditions where leaders will do better work on collective impact that the United Way is trying to drive in that community. And it was an interesting partnership between a philanthropy and a United Way in order to support the kind of leadership development in the field that they felt was preventing them from being able to do the impact they were trying to get to.
So if we are going to be able to really move the needle on these, Katherine was saying anything that's red on any map is bad. So we have been talking about going from red to green. So if we're going to do this in Atlanta, we're going to have to continue this conversation and also build these various muscles that you've heard about here today. The whole issue around capacity building, culture, leadership. It has just been a rich conversation that we will need to continue as United Way as we try to drive this change, and as we say, we want to be the backbone that fuels this movement for child well-being. And as we continue to do this, this dialogue will have to continue. But this last point that Paul just made is really critical for us as to how we build capacity in community I hate this bottom up, but pardon that expression, but all across all levels of community. And so I just really want to thank Paul and Kathryn today for really, really elevating the conversation and definitely giving us a lot to think about. And we will see more of them. Paul doesn't know that yet, but he'll be back. So thank you very much for being here. And
Okay, thanks again to Paul and Kathryn and Etha, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. We are going to do, again, what we did at our last meeting, real time, and if you have your phones, go to menti.com and just give you an opportunity if you'd like to announce any upcoming meetings or events that you have. We'd love to put them up here, and then they do show up again on our website. We send them out, that's what it is. I knew there was an opportunity where we do share them, so if you have events that you want to publicize that are open to the public or open to the folks that are in this room, if you would put them up on screen at that number that you saw. Just as a reminder, there were a lot of great things that I heard this morning that reinforce what we're doing here at InForum. About the culture of community and the culture of collective impact, relationships, trust, values, all of those things are connected to the purpose of InForum, so that was very encouraging. As a reminder, our next InForum, which is coming up in May, is going to be at a different location. We hope that you will be with us. We will be talking about mental health, resiliency. It is going to be at the Loudermilk Center, and we have Dr. Glenda Wren, who will be joining us. She is the director of the Kennedy Satcher Center for Mental Health Equity. She's also a professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine. We will be working with our colleagues in health at the United Way. And we will be joined by Erica Fenner-Sitkoff, who is the Executive Director of Voices for Georgia's Children. So that will be, I'm sure, a very interesting conversation about mental health resiliency. That is again in May at Loudermilk, and then we'll be back here again in June for our final InForum session. We'll be talking about literacy across the 2-gen spectrum, and that'll be our final conversation in the InForum series, and then we'll start up again in January of 2019, and hope that you'll join us again. So some of your announcements are just our announcements are showing up. Does anyone have their phone out? We've got 3 events coming up, but oh, I think I saw one, children's breakfast. It's going to come back up. In any event, these will continue. Covenant House, okay, great. Night of Broadway Stars. We have United Way State of the Children Breakfast coming up at the end of April. That's next week. Anyway, these will be up here as you continue to network. JFCS is coming up, the tasting, that's great. As you network, these will be up here and we will send them out. Just a reminder, please, you'll get an email in your inbox tomorrow with a survey about this session and also any other comments you might have about the InForum series, suggestions about speakers, any comments that you'd like to share. We welcome them. very much. So another round of applause for Kathryn and for Paul. Thank them very much. We look forward to seeing you in May. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you.